everyone, and welcome to A Mighty Blaze's historical fiction YA panel. So today we have some amazingly talented authors with us here to discuss their newest novels in the historical fiction genre. So please join me in welcoming our amazing authors, Erica Martin, Kathryn Williams, Carolyn Tara O'Neil, and Jennieke Cohen. Thank you guys so much for coming today.
Thank you for having us.
Let's start off by just doing some introductions, your books, maybe a quick elevator pitch on what they're about. And why don't we start with Erica?
Hey everyone, my name is Erica Martin, and I wrote a debut poetry collection called And We Rise, the Civil Rights Movement in Poems. Now, it went back and forth between historical fiction and nonfiction because so much of that timeline has been purposely hidden. So it was very hard for me to find some bits and pieces of information that I needed. So some of it is nonfiction and very small bits of it is historical fiction. And I was really excited to put it in poems. So that's the introduction for me.
Kathryn, what about you?
Yeah. Hi, I'm Kathryn Williams, and I'm the author of The Storyteller. Backwards. So, and this is sort of a genre blending historical mystery with a touch of romance, a sprinkling of romance. It follows 17-year-old Jess, who finds a mysterious trunk full of journals in a language that she doesn't recognize in her late great-great-aunt's attic. And it leads her down a twisty-turny path that connects with the history of the Romanov family, particularly Anastasia, the youngest daughter of the Romanovs, and what happened to her. And I won't say more, but there's the setup, and that might sound familiar as we go to our next panelist.
And why don't we go to Carolyn next?
Sure, let's continue the theme. So I'm Carolyn Tara O'Neil. I'm the author of Daughters of a Dead Empire. The beautiful cover is on the wall behind me, right there. It's a historical thriller that comes out February 22nd from Macmillan, and it imagines what would have happened if Anastasia Romanov had survived her family's execution, only to escape and find herself in communist territory. So she is accidentally rescued by another teenage girl who is a communist peasant activist. And so these two girls from opposite backgrounds find themselves on the run from the Red Army, who are trying to track down and finish the job of killing off the Romanovs. So it's set in 1918 Russia. And yes, we have lots of interesting things to talk about with our Anastasia retelling. So, yeah.
And Jennieke, why don't you tell us about your story?
So my book is called, sorry, I'm getting a little feedback, My Fine Fellow. And it is about it is a historical retelling of My Fair Lady, Pygmalion, gender swapped, where these two girls who are experts in food basically teach this young man to become a gentleman chef to royalty and high society.
That sounds awesome. I'm really excited to read all of your books. I guess I want to start out, because Erica actually touched on this. The first thing I want to start out with is, what's the difference between historical fiction and nonfiction? And did you have a hard time trying to find that line between the two while you were writing?
Yeah, I did, because a lot of people don't know this, but my mother actually marched with Dr. King. So I had a bit of firsthand knowledge of what she saw and what she went through. Her and her sisters, she was like, yeah, getting to the back of the bus was very normal, or, it was very, you don't think differently at that moment. So what was harder to find were the things that were put away, hidden, that we don't see in textbooks. So I had to kind of improvise based off her knowledge and interviews with different people. So I would call very bits of it historical fiction, because I'm not saying it's entirely true, but it's mostly true. So I would say historical fiction is mostly true and nonfiction is absolutely true.
Awesome. Yeah, it's kind of tricky with that one. Did any of you guys have any trouble trying to find that line between the two? And was there a reason you chose to go with historical fiction over nonfiction?
I'm curious to hear what Carolyn will say about this as well. And I love that we're all on this panel, because I think this is a theme that I definitely wanted to explore a little bit in my book of what is the historical record that we have. And there are facts that people can agree on, but a lot of times facts can be arranged in slightly different ways for different narratives. And to serve different purposes. And so one thing that I was always asking myself is, which facts to stick to, and how was I arranging them, and when was I veering from them to serve the story, and to be really conscious about that. And there are accounts that disagree, and different people lay claim to different versions of truth. So that was something that I kind of dug into, and I'm curious too to hear what Carolyn might say about that.
Yeah, agreed. At least 3 of us are writing about real people who lived, right? So it's a very delicate act of playing with, I guess, Erica, you were sticking closer, I think, to to real history than Kathryn or I were. But, it's a very delicate matter, frankly, taking the lives of people who really lived and turning it into narrative or poetry or some sort of creative form. I think there's a lot of respect that has to happen when you're doing that, and a lot of care that ought to be taken, in my opinion, around how you're framing these lives. For me, I love historical fiction because it allows me to dig into the small in history, whereas I think so much of our nonfiction and our history in classes and in schools, at least in a lot of my classrooms, focused on sort of the meta, right? The large scale, the big names, the movers and shakers of history. And what I love about historical fiction is the opportunity to explore the day-to-day, to sort of immerse yourself in this different time period, which may as well be almost a different world. And so Anastasia was my entree into this time period, right? And so you have this wonderful mythical legend of the survival of Anastasia. And she, unfortunately in 2007, we did find her remains were found. So unfortunately, we have learned or confirmed that she did die with the rest of her family. However, that legend is very dear to a lot of people. And so that was really, and dear to me. So that was my entree into the history. And I really enjoyed balancing that like real person, although I have my own take on her, with the unknown lives of the peasants and the workers and the people in the area that my characters pass through.
I did want to ask you guys, because like you were saying, there is a lot of pressure when you're writing historical fiction to do justice to that time period. My question is, how much research did you do, and was your process of writing any different because it was historical fiction versus if you were just writing regular fiction? Jennieke, do you want to say?
I'll start. I think so. Yes, I did a lot of research. I think with this book, I ended up doing less than I did with my first book, which was a straight historical fiction novel. And then this one, I decided to do more of an alternate history, an alternate timeline. So that gave me some flexibility, but it also meant that, like I had to make my decisions about which pieces were going to be extremely accurate to the historical period, which is the 1830s, and which pieces, I could take some liberties with. But because, the things that I wanted to be very careful with were anti-Semitism in this time period. One of my main characters is Jewish. And so I wanted to be very careful with what the experience would have been like for Jews in that time. And so I did quite a bit of research into that. And as well as I also did a lot of research into the food of the time period, because there's so much food in this book, and then decided from there like where I was going to take the liberties and what would serve the story. But I try to make it clear in the author's notes so that people can understand where the line was between fiction and history.
Did you guys usually start doing your research before you wrote the book, or did you start writing and then did the research as you were writing? Or does it depend on the person?
Well, I'll just go quickly, but like mine, I started doing research about the Jewish people in that era sort of on my own, just for my own edification, and then I decided to actually put it into this book. So I had sort of started my research not knowing that it was going to be used. And then as I had like a contract to get this book done at a certain time. And so, I was trying to research as I was writing. I don't know what everyone else did.
Yeah.
Mine was largely parallel. I think I was researching. There's just so much material about the Romanovs. It's almost bottomless. And so first I was sort of feeling around to see what sources were going to be really helpful to me. And a lot of it was parallel. I think I could research forever and never write a book if I tried to learn everything there is to learn.
Yeah, it's hard to get to a point, though, I find in my writing, just when you get to a point where you think you have enough that you're confident enough to write. So I'm very impressed that you guys are able to pull off full novels. I could never. Erica, how was your research? Obviously, a lot of yours was, close to
For my research, I'm from Memphis, where the Civil Rights Museum is and where Dr. King was assassinated. So we have kind of been ingrained to learn about civil rights from the moment we're little. So a lot of my research was finding things that I didn't already know. Like, it's very hard to find day-to-day accounts of what it was like to live in the Jim Crow era. So I had to interview my mom, my family, random people who are from that time. I had to look up, I just wanted to fill in the small beats to really put people in that time period. Because of course you have Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King, and then everyone knows their story. But what about the school kid who just wanted to attend school, but they couldn't because, segregation? Or what about the normalized of buildings being white only? Like in Memphis, there are a lot of leftover bits of that. Like there's a building where you can clearly tell that it was a segregated building where there's two separate sides of a doctor's office. So for me, it was very like almost mesmerizing. Wow, this wasn't even that long ago. My mom lived through this. My grandma lived through this. So we like to think of civil rights as something that happened a long time ago because we associate it with just Rosa Parks, Malcolm X, and Martin Luther King in a very peaceful way. But in truth, it's just really terrible. Like what my mom had to go through and what everybody had to go through, like no one should have went through that. And the cognitive dissonance, you know what I'm trying to say, between the history books and what really happened is huge. So for me, I just really wanted to close that gap and let people know this was really bad. And it wasn't just Martin Luther King doing his speeches and everything was, happily ever after. No, it was just really awful. So for my research, I just wanted to dig deep, and I don't want to say spoil, but you can't spoil a book like that. But I just want everyone to see what it was really like and be in that time period.
That's really amazing. Carolyn, what kind of research did you have to do?
Sure. And, just Erica, to what you're saying, I think that is some of the most wonderful things about historical fiction and creative nonfiction is the ability to transport the reader back into this moment in time that maybe we haven't done such a good job of preserving and teaching and bringing to the present day and remembering. For me, the research came first. I sort of fell in love with the history of the Russian Revolution very randomly one day and picked up a wonderful book that called A People's Tragedy. that does quite a good job of exploring the impact of these great scale events. You know, the World War I, the Russian Revolution, the fall of the Romanovs, the birth of, you know, the communist nation, all of these incredibly dramatic events. Did a very good job of translating it to like the day-to-day lives of people. So that really sparked a passion for the history. And it was from the history that I then, you know, came to the story.
Wow. So it must have taken a lot of research to get to those places. That's amazing. We're going to go into individual questions. For Jennieke, we were talking about how your book has a lot of culinary stuff, food and cuisines of different kinds. My question was, what was that? Is that an interest in your own life, using cuisine? And did you have to research the different cuisines of the international foods and all of that was going on at that time?
Yeah, it is an interest of mine. I once thought I was going to go to culinary school, so it's something I've been, you know, into just for fun for most of my life. And as for the international cuisine, yeah, I definitely did some research into the particular, when I decided like which countries or which food cultures I wanted to be highlighting. I did extra research into those cultures because, you know, obviously I've eaten those foods, but I wanted to make sure that I had things as accurate as possible. And then, yeah, so, and then also I did like research into sort of like the supply chain issues of where, how these foods would have gotten to England, which is obviously where my book is set. And so, yeah, it was kind of interesting. My husband tells me that's my economic degree coming in, because I was like subconsciously just doing this stuff and trying to figure out global supply chain, which is so random.
That's amazing. Do you have a specific recipe from your book or a specific food from your book that you might recommend to people?
Oh, well, I have like a lot of Filipino foods in there, kind of randomly. One of my favorite is, because one of my main characters is half Filipino, like me. And so she kind of shows these foods to her friends and they get to taste them. So one of them that I really love is bibingka, which is like a rice dessert with a lot of sugar. It's like brown sugar and rice, and then it's steamed. And so it's like a little steamed rice cake, I guess. That's quite sweet. So that's one of my favorites that I think people should try.
I should look for that one. That sounds amazing. Going to Carolyn. With your book, you have a lot of, there's a lot of emotional aspects of the revolution that you have to look into. And a lot of people, you know, lived through this time, so you have to respect it. My question is, how did you go about trying to portray all of these emotional aspects? And was it difficult for you to try to get in that mindset to understand how the people were thinking?
You know, I'd say yes and no. Especially to that latter question of how difficult it was. One of the reasons I was drawn to this story was because of how so many of the issues that my characters are grappling with parallel where we are 100 years later, right? So the income inequality that is at the heart of what people were so outraged over, the income inequality, the over-militarization, the poor representation in government. You know, a lot of these things are issues that we're really grappling with today. So to a certain extent, you know, that was pretty easy for me to identify with. I think that on the flip side, you know, I'm telling the story of a girl whose family has just been murdered, right? So so the book literally starts, you know, a day or two after Anastasia has fled her family's massacre, and that, of course, was a tremendous challenge, one that I put a lot of thought into. And ultimately, you know, just felt like there wasn't going to be a way I was going to get this right. Right. There are lots of ways I could get it wrong, but not a way that I was going to get it right. And so that was very much walking a fine line of thinking about, okay, how am I expressing who she is as a person, getting to know her personality, and still respecting and, you know, feeling some of the trauma that she's grappling with in this story. And both of the girls, it's a dual POV novel. So both characters are grappling with trauma, and that really impacts their relationship with each other. Both of their traumas are caused by the friends and allies of the other girl. So a lot of their journey is about is about sort of, growing friendship that is complicated by a lot of this emotional weight.
And a lot of you, I mean, all of you guys used a lot of characters that were younger in age because obviously it's YA. But what was that like trying to picture a young person in these time periods? Was it a little bit harder to do than having an adult person that was going through this at just such a young age with all of that emotion and stuff going around? It must have been a little bit difficult.
For me, I don't know. I don't think it was. I don't know why, but I guess, in previous time periods, people had much shorter lifespans. So, like they were almost adults when they were in their teenage years, I think, or in many cases. So yeah, I didn't particularly find it hard, but I don't know what everyone else experiences.
I had a conversation about this recently, and I think for me, one of the reasons that I love young adult literature is that it's the human drama sometimes just writ large. Like, I remember, I think as a writer in general, but also as a teenager, my emotions were just under the skin. You know what I mean? And so the highs felt really high and the lows felt really low. And that makes for really wonderful drama. So I think in a way there's some freedom in writing that phase of life because young people aren't afraid of going there sort of with that emotion. And that can be really great in a story and freeing. So yeah, I find it liberating in some ways.
Awesome. We're going to go to Kathryn because I do have a question for you. I was wondering if you had to look at any other, I mean, there were so many theories of the Anastasia, so many different tellings of the legend. So did you go through any of these and did you consider them while trying to pick out your own story?
All of them. Yeah, I mean, Carolyn, I can't wait to read your book too, to see how you handled some of these questions. I mean, I can't tell you how many endings my book had at one point or another. And going down the rabbit holes of like forensic DNA research. And I mean, there are books just about what, the drama of the DNA testing that was done and like, trying to look for loopholes to drive a Mack truck through. I mean, yes, it was, I got really into all of the different theories. And one of the main themes of my book is imposters. And what can be true in an imposter's story and what motivates imposters. And there were many people who came forward claiming to be a Romanov in the years following the assassination. And of course, as Carolyn mentioned, their bodies weren't uncovered for decades. So that was fertile ground for theories. And it also served the Bolsheviks to have some mystery around it and not to fully answer the question right away. I'm losing the thread of my answer here. But yeah, I really went down a lot of those rabbit holes and there were many to go down. And I also wanted to come back to say to Carolyn that I appreciated what you were talking about too. All of us, I think, were on a panel about historical YA, but a lot of the emotional like fodder of our books is still very much present, and there's not a clear line always between what is past and what is present. And I think about like a lot of the geopolitical forces are the same as we watch what's happening in the headlines, right? Like domestically, internationally, anti-Semitism and racism and communism and sovereignty and individualism versus collectivism. And so I think that's why there will always be a place for historical stories because they speak to the present. So I appreciated the question, Birdie, and Carolyn, your words on that. So yeah.
Erica, your book is a little bit different from theirs in that you did a poetry layout. So my question was, what made you decide to do that sort of layout? Is poetry always something that you wrote more than fiction? Was it harder? Was it easier to get across what you want to say through poetry?
Well, I'm going to be 100% honest. When I was in high school, I hated history. So my goal with poetry was to make it accessible, because I remember we were read poetry throughout our entire high school, and we loved it. So I'm like, I thought about that. I'm like, okay, this is a lot of information that needs to be put onto pages, and it needs to be done in an interesting way. I'm like, oh, poetry. And also, since most of my collection is nonfiction, I will say it was harder because I couldn't take as many creative licenses as I would have if it was straight historical or just straight fiction. Like, for instance, I had a little more leeway with Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King's poetry sections because everyone knows their story. So, but as far as the unknown figures or lesser known figures, I had to get their story down, and I didn't want people confused, like, what is she talking about? Who is she talking about? So it was a little bit harder in that regard because for me, it was information over craft at that point. And I didn't want to, be egotistical and, oh, this is my craft. Here's my poetry. It was all about getting the information to the young adult audience in an accessible but interesting way. So it was a little bit challenging to get that down, but I think I did a good job, and I hope everyone, agrees with me.
Of course. I'm sure it's amazing. I can't wait to read it. What I did also want to ask was, you talk about some lesser known figures that you included. What are some of those lesser known figures? And when you were writing their stories, did you kind of have to, as you were saying, you kind of wrote out their stories and then have to write the poetry afterwards just to make sure you were including all the information?
I did. At first, I would have their story, and then I would look at my poetry side by side. I'm like, does this bit of information need to be here? Or this definitely needs to be here. But like Stokely Carmichael, Black Power, no one knows him. Well, not many people. Like, I only learned about him 3 years ago, and I devour history from high school on, and I'm 10 years out of high school. That was the first time I ever heard of him when I looked him up on my own. Or Matthew Johnson. Unarmed Black shootings by white cops have been happening way before recently, and I didn't know that. Like, even the figures that I have in there from there until now, there's a big list, which I'll have to touch on in another work probably. But it was like, wow, there's so much, hidden information. So for me, it was, I need to get this down. Everyone needs to know this has been happening for a long time, not just recently. Who else? A lot of people it's becoming more known that Claudette Colvin was the first person who wouldn't give her per seat. So I didn't learn that in high school or even in college. So I've made sure that was in there. So, it was very difficult because I was kind of sad writing it. I'm like, wow, it shouldn't have taken me 30 years to learn all of this. I should have learned this in high school. So that was my main motivation.
And when you are writing with historical figures, and this is for everyone, when you're writing historical figures that existed and then combine them with fictional characters, is that kind of hard to do? Was that difficult for you to try to figure out how they would act in a way? Yeah. Carolyn, did you have something?
Yeah, I'll jump in on that one. So, 100%. So for me, I very much landed in a place where the Anastasia who is in my book, she's not the real Anastasia, right? This is not the real person. This is a character who is invented, who came from my mind and my heart. Like, she is a fictional character. And that was very much something that was a learning for me over the course of writing this book, was like, even though of course I drew from real life, I drew from accounts of her sisters and her parents and her like tutors, and these were things that inspired me in shaping the character of Anna in the book. She is a fictional character. She is somebody I invented, and I think it's pretty important for readers to know that and to realize like that this is not a portrayal of the girl exactly as she was.
What about you, Kathryn? Did you feel the same way?
Yeah. So my you say her name so much more fluidly than I do, Carolyn. I'm from the South. I say Anastasia, but and actually, when they were doing the audiobook, I had a question from the narrator saying, "How do you want me to pronounce?" I was like, "No, please say it the correct way." Anyway, I was also drawing on letters and diaries, and so I had this taste of her real voice, and I was trying to capture it to some degree. Of course, fictionalizing it. Her diaries did not survive, though many of her sisters did, or some of her sisters did. So that did give me some license there and some room to imagine her voice. But there were a few different layers in the voice that I had to create for the Anastasia character of my book. And sometimes blending real people with fictional people were sort of Easter eggs for my story as well. So there was thought that went into, is this going to be an historical person or a fictional person? But yeah, I mean, I think there's a moment in my book where my main character so there's two timelines. There is the from the earliest is 1913 through the 1930s for one character, and then the other timeline is 2007, 2008 for reasons that will become clear. But the main character from 2007, as she's reading some diaries, has this moment of clarity of this isn't a story, this was real life, and this really happened to someone, and that brings this very sort of chilling horror over the experience that she's reading about. And so there was that layer of responsibility whenever I was writing about someone real, feeling like I was accurately portraying them. There were a few minor characters that maybe I took who were brief mentions, who maybe I took a little bit of liberty with. But yeah, blending them was really fun. It was really fun.
Did you get to add like details here or there when you say Easter eggs, like little details that people can pick up on?
I hope so. As I have friends and family reading it, I'm like, did you pick up on this? And so I think some of them are successful and some of them are probably not. They're like the bone that the dog buried and lost. But
that's the important thing.
Yeah.
When we go to historical fiction as a genre as a whole, and we talk about the YA world, one of my questions, and we kind of touched on it already, is how can it be used to educate young readers more than just reading from a textbook? How is it different?
It has to be, I wouldn't say necessarily entertaining, but accessible. And that might sound cliche, but I only liked one of my history classes in high school. But then when I got to college, the professors had a little more leeway in how they could teach. And I was like, wow, this is so interesting. So like it was the way that it was taught, not necessarily, I'm pretty sure you can get any kid interested if it's put the right way, if you say it the right way, if you write it the right way. So for me, it comes down to accessibility. No one wants to be bored and feeling like they're reading a textbook. And that was my main thought, like, well, I'm bored if I'm writing it like this. They're definitely bored. So I love history so much now. And this is coming from someone who hated it in high school. I just found the right people who said it the right way. And I think that's very possible through books.
Amazing.
Erica, I think that's such a good point about accessibility because, I remember it can be that one book that somebody reads and then they get into a time period or they get into a character in his or a person from history. And I think probably that's happened to most of us here on this panel, right? And I remember when I was young, probably in middle school, I read a novel about Lady Jane Grey, the teenager who ruled England for 9 days. And I was so amazed by the fact that there was a teenager who was the Queen of England for 9 whole days. And so it got me into that period. And so I think that's such a good point. And I do try to do that with my novels too. I try to come up with things that are accessible for people. And then, you talk about the things that are also important to you as a writer.
That's amazing. And do you think it's more impactful for historical fiction to write it for young adults than regular adult fiction? Why did you guys choose particularly young adults?
I just felt like for mine, it was my voice seemed to fit in young adult, and also my characters, they're going through things that teenagers are going through, but also things that adults go through. So it felt like a natural place to be, for my particular stuff.
For me,
Kathryn,
I'm
sorry.
sorry.
Go ahead, Erica.
Well, for me, as I said earlier, it's really about accessibility. I'm kind of bummed that I didn't enjoy my history classes more when I was in high school because of the way they were taught. And when I found that 1 or 2 or 3 professors that really, made it sound so fascinating, the way he was narrating, wow, I was right there with him. So for me, it's about providing literature that teenagers who wants to get into history, or maybe they don't know they like history, but I want to give them the chance. Maybe they won't like my book, I don't know, but if they do, great. And I just want to get the information out there. I want to, just accessibility is so important in my opinion.
That's amazing. Yeah, I totally agree. I know, Kathryn, you said a little bit about emotional aspects that with young adults you can make it a little bit more dramatic. Is there any other reasons that you've had for doing young adults? Is the issues that young adults face more interesting to you, or are there major themes that younger characters can relate to more than older people?
Yeah, so this is my 4th book for young adults. And I don't feel necessarily locked into that genre. I right now I'm playing around with the middle grade idea. I also write or have tried to write for adults. But I think what I keep coming back to in every story, every young adult story that I tell, or every story that has a teenage protagonist with a teen reader in mind, I should say, is that they tend to be stories about figuring out who you are. That seems to be really the big question of those years. And at least it was for me. And so, especially in writing a story about identity, I think it felt really natural to have a protagonist who's asking those questions about their own identity. So I think sometimes the story itself, the themes of the story kind of dictate what the genre is. And certainly the age of the protagonist, though you can have books intended for adults that have younger protagonists. I don't think that books with adult protagonists tend to do well with the teen audience, but maybe, yeah. But yeah, I think that just that central question of, okay, but who am I? Really lends itself to the young adult genre.
I totally agree. And I think it's always really great for young adults to be seeing characters living in different time periods at the same age of them and kind of being able to see what's different, what's the same. Because some things, as we said, some things never change. Some things are very, very different and good for it. Carolyn, I know you kind of chose because Anastasia was a young woman. Was that kind of your reasoning for choosing a young character?
Sort of. I mean, certainly, yeah. I mean, she was 17 when she died. So that certainly, if I didn't have to write about Anastasia. I could have written about somebody else from the time period. For me, I'll say two things. And the first is, Erica, to your point about accessibility, that's really a driving motivation for me as well, is telling a story. And that's why, I wrote a thriller. It's not a very literary novel. I wrote a thriller. It's something that I really want to excite young readers and get them excited about the history. And also because history can feel very academic and, can be a little overwhelming, I think, to some readers, including myself. Especially when I was younger. And so accessibility was also fundamental for me in telling this story. The second thing I'll say is, Kathryn, to your point about just what it is to be a teenager, right? So for me, I think the reason I keep getting drawn back to the young adult, space is because I'm very interested in stories about, how the societies we live in shape who we are as people. That is again and again, that's what I keep coming back to. And I think teenagers are really in that moment of starting to realize, who am I and why, right? What is it? What are the things around me that are shaping who my parents are and how we live, and, all of the different inequalities and inequities in our society, excuse me, and all of the different structures that dictate or shape, in a lot of ways, our lives. And so I think I think teenagers really are in that moment of starting to, figure that out, or starting to explore that. And I think that's what draws me back again and again.
That's awesome. Well, we're starting to run out of time. So I did want to wrap it up by just going around and saying, is there anything that you hope that young readers really take from your book as they're reading? What do you hope that they take out of it? Kathryn, do you have something?
I think every book that I write, I want someone to feel and think, maybe find some empathy within it. I think that's the power of fiction, or any creatively told story, I should say. Certainly poetry as well. I guess I would want a takeaway to be for them to think about what is their most authentic self.
That's a great takeaway. Jennieke, what about you?
Well, I hope that they get a little perspective of other people's lives and, what it might be like to be Jewish in that time period. And there's obviously a lot of overlap between that time period and now. And also get I have my half Filipino character. I hope they get a little extra perspective there too. And also that, it's fun and that they get that it's an enjoyable experience as they hopefully learn something about society in general.
So, Erica, what about you?
I hope the main takeaway from my collection is that era, Jim Crow, wasn't easy peasy March, oh yay, peace is over, because that's how it's mostly portrayed everywhere in media and in textbooks. It was very hard. I just want them to dig deep further. Well, they don't even have to dig further deeper. I just want them to realize how really hard it was, and that most of the people who went through that or who did those things are still alive. In fact, Carolyn Bryant is still alive. Emmett Till's famous lie whistle lady. She's very much still alive from what I heard in Memphis. So I just want people to realize, hey, these people are still alive. They might be quieter now, but that hate was present and is very, very violent, extremely violent, as you'll see when you read. And also another takeaway was to give yourself a chance to explore history, not even just the history I'm presenting, but like don't ignore it by default of what it is. You know, I hope that readers want to explore more history after they read mine.
And Carolyn, what do you want readers to take out of it?
Yeah, similarly to that, Erica, I hope that, you know, some young readers spark an interest in the history of the Russian Revolution and the history of Russia in general. I hope that comes out of this book. And then I think, you know, I hope they get whatever they need from the book, really. But one of the key themes is certainly about connecting across social and political divides, and sort of finding the commonality in people who believe in very different things from what we believe in. And so that's, I think, there's no message to the book. There's no message, but if there had to be, if I were forced to say something was kind of the message, it'd probably be that.
Amazing. Well, thank you all so much for joining us. Everyone should please check out their new works that are coming out. We have And We Rise, Daughters of a Dead Empire, The Storyteller, and My Fine Fellows. So please check them out. I'm sure they're absolutely amazing. I can't wait to read them. And if anyone else, I'm trying to think. Okay, no. Thank you so much for coming, and we hope to see everyone at the next panel.
Thank you.
Thank you.